when I heard the song, I thought to myself, well, this is one of, if not the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard. Why would anybody not want this to come out? I wanted to grab the world by its collar and shake them and said, do you understand how important this Brian Wilson guy is? Why is he being left in these circumstances that are killing his creativity? Those of us who were mourning the loss of Smile for decades, we believed that if Brian ever could somehow finish it, it would lift this enormous weight from him, and he would then again create more great music.
Welcome to Grind and Flow, creative minds worth your time. I'm your host, Chuck Moore. Our episode today brings together a number of compelling stories of creative courage, fortuitous happenstance, and the triumphant, long-delayed completion of one of pop music's most mythologized, abandoned projects. Our guest today is award-winning director, film producer, and author David Leaf. His latest book is Smile, The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson is, of course, the chief architect and visionary engine behind the Beach Boys' iconic music. Our focus today is on Smile, which was to be the follow-up album to the Beach Boys' landmark Pet Sounds. You might be hearing about Pet Sounds lately, as this year marks the 60th anniversary of its original release in May of '66. Pet Sounds has famously inspired generations of musicians at the highest levels. Sir Paul McCartney told today's guest that nobody is educated musically until they've heard Pet Sounds. Smile was to be even more audacious and slated for release in that watershed music year of 1967. That release did not happen. Why? David gets into that with his book, which we'll discuss here, and also we'll get into the dramatic completion and release of Smile in 2004. David was right there up in it, witnessing this firsthand. David's own story is also remarkable. He's a fan who became Brian's friend, and if you've listened to Grind and Flow before, you know I love a good origin story and those unexpected curveballs that can positively change a personal trajectory. We'll talk about seizing those moments as they happen, and also key takeaways about finding courage to face your fears and bringing closure to daunting, unfinished business. So let's get into it now with author David Leaf. The first question I usually start off with is pretend I'm 8 years old, and who are you and what do you do?
Well, my name is David Leaf. I am a storyteller, and whether I'm writing a book or making a documentary film or working on a television show or teaching at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, it's all about telling stories about things that I think really matter. In this case, my life, the biggest part of my life has been telling Brian Wilson's story.
So what do you find most fulfilling about what you do, and what is the most challenging?
The most challenging always is finding money from a distributor or a production company so that we can get the money to do what we want to do. The most fulfilling is any project that I'm excited about, that I'm passionate about, because the stories I want to tell are typically about the greatest artists that I've come into contact with in one way or another. And it's because I believe that between the mid-50s and say into the late 80s, early 90s, there was a songwriting renaissance. There were more great songwriters making music during that time than I think at any other time in music history. There are so many artists who I am crazy in love with, and I want to tell their stories.
So what is your book about? And what is it about that particular person and that particular work in his career that attracted you?
So in the 60s, the Beatles were my holy grail.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Beach Boys concert actually when I was in high school.
Okay.
Bought a couple of their singles, but they were just among the many groups on the radio whose music hit me hard. When I was in college, there was a Rolling Stone article, a two-part cover story on the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson. It was to promote the Surf's Up album. so titled because it included Surf's Up, which was to be the centerpiece I would learn from this article about a aborted project called Smile. And when I heard the song, I thought to myself, well, this is one of, if not the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard. Why would anybody not want this to come out? When I heard the album, the next to last track was a song called Till I Die, which was like in my room if it was written as a suicide note. What I heard was that Surf's Up was as great, if not greater, than what the article promised. And Till I Die proved to me that Brian still had the ability to do it. And so my roommate and I, we went down the rabbit hole of the Beach Boys in 1971.
Right.
And at some point he said to me, if you're so upset about this, why don't you go do something about it?
Nice challenge.
I said, okay, I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile.
Easy enough.
Easy enough. It only took 33 years, but it did happen. So the book is written in part from a first-person narrative in that I was there when Smile was resurrected. The birth of Smile and the death of Smile, the shelving of Smile, was something that I, wasn't there for. So I was relying on eyewitness testimony. And I went to my publisher a number of years ago and said, I'd like to do a book for the 20th anniversary of Beautiful Dreamer, which was the documentary I made about Brian finally finishing Smile. And he said, what do you have in mind? I said, well, I'd like to, the documentary only includes like 1% of the interviews. I'd love to publish a book of all of the interviews. And he said, interview books don't do well for us. If you write it as a living history, then we'd be really interested. We'd want to do that. And my heart sunk because I knew how much work that was going to be.
Right.
So the grind was, now in my corner to tell this story in a way that would flow naturally with the witnesses who were there in 66 and 67, and then the witnesses from 2003, 2004, who were part of its resurrection.
Right. You're basically editing another documentary.
That's exactly what I'm doing. The whole point of my work in Beautiful Dreamer and in this book is for the people who are not Beach Boys fans. Is that if you don't know who Brian Wilson is, if you don't know anything about Smile, I'm hoping that you will read this and go, oh my God, I've got to hear that music.
So is it even possible to overstate the impact Brian specifically might have had on the Beatles, which I think is the remarkable, like the hook into the story?
Well, here are the two things that I think make it clear, and these were both said to me by knights of the British Empire. Sir Paul McCartney told me in an interview that nobody is educated musically until they've heard Pet Sounds. And I've given a copy of it to each of my children.
Oh, wow.
Sir George Martin said that Sgt. Pepper was our attempt to equal Pet Sounds. Accent on the word attempt.
Right.
So how can you be more influential on them than that?
The highest of praise.
Yes. Sir George Martin should have been the King of England, the classiest gentleman that ever existed. And when I was interviewing him, he didn't know that Brian also sang on the records. So he knew that he wrote the songs and composed the melodies. He knew that Brian did the arrangements for the backing tracks and the vocals, and he knew he produced them. And when I said, well, Sir George, that's Brian's voice, a high voice, he goes, nobody should have that much talent. That's not fair. That's how talented Brian was. Everybody in the LA music scene knew he was the guy. He was the leader. David Crosby used to go up to Brian's house because Brian had two 4-track recorders up there to hear what Brian was working on because he wanted to know what direction he was going in so that the Byrds would, try to catch up with what he was doing. So that's how big a deal he was. If we talk about grind and flow, Brian was compulsively making records to satisfy everybody's demands and needs. There could be 3 albums a year, there could be 4 albums a year. It was, and music was pouring out of him. He was a total music maker. However, the music he was making didn't necessarily fit in with what the record company saw, which is we've got this great formula. You're called the Beach Boys. Give us some more of these surfing or car and fun in the sun, girls on the beach kind of songs. And he had that had run its course for him as an artist. And so he was exploring his emotions. If one were to listen to side 2 of the Beach Boys today in 1965 and much of Summer Days and Summer Nights and the single Little Girl I Once Knew, one could construct the prequel to Pet Sounds. So it was clear where he was going, where he wanted to go. He was the only one who wanted to go in that direction. The record company told him when he turned Pet Sounds in, it's like, can't you give us some more of those songs like California Girls? And as he tells the story, he said, oh, see you later. And then he went and did Good Vibrations, which was as unusual a record as had ever been made up till that point, and maybe ever. And it became a worldwide million-selling #1. So from his point of view, he's doing what he wants, going in the right direction, and he's getting static. He could have benefited from somebody who could keep, so to speak, the wolves at bay, and that's what David Anderle was there to do. Right. He set up Brother Records for Brian's projects outside the Beach Boys. But the problems that Brian ran into was that it was a family business.
Right.
And Brian came to understand as he was working on Smile that the family business was in jeopardy because of this.
Right.
And so, as he said, it's one of the saddest things I've ever heard him say. I figured I needed a year to finish it, and nobody would give me a year. And so he shelved it.
Right. And this also came at a time when his emotional problems started to rise as well.
Well, I think he always had emotional problems, because if you're getting beaten, abused as a young person, I don't think that ever escapes you.
Right.
And so he's hanging out with friends, he's doing drugs, and what the cause and effect of that is impossible to know. One would need a forensic drug psychiatrist to really know when drugs became more important than making music.
So it's interesting, going back real quick to Pet Sounds, the accusations or the disappointment from the record company. Just as you're talking, it really doesn't make sense, because I feel like they had hits or potential hits like, Wouldn't It Be Nice and God Only Knows.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, you've got 4 top 40 hits on Pet Sounds. Sloop John B., Caroline No, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and God Only Knows. If the record company had put a sticker on the album, includes the 4 hits, and listed them, people would go, oh, I like those songs.
Right.
But that wasn't what, in a sense, they sabotaged him by putting out this Best of the Beach Boys. But that didn't stop him. He went right to Good Vibrations. While he was finishing Good Vibrations, he began writing the music of Smile with Van Dyke Parks as his lyricist. And the first song they wrote was Heroes and Villains. In short order, they wrote Wonderful and Surf's Up and Cabin Essence. So his creative flow was astonishing, because he and Van Dyke would write the songs, and then Brian would go to the studio and record the instrumental tracks. So there's this enormous flow of creativity in the fall of '66, working with Van Dyke Parks, and somebody said the only peer he ever really wrote with, the only person who could sit down at the piano and play to Brian's level. Van Dyke was a terrific pianist. He understood the orchestra. Obviously an incredible lyricist, and so
And a fascinating character.
an unbelievably fascinating character. So you've got this great collaboration, and it just didn't meet with the approval of Brian's world.
So in 1967, Brian Wilson steps away from Smile to keep the peace and a lucrative family business on track. Reminder here, the Beach Boys included Brian's brothers Carl and Dennis, as well as their first cousin Mike Love. And if you've been in a family business or worked for one, you know that can be a whole lot of something. This Beach Boys family dynamic has fueled decades of intrigue and high drama, which continues to current day. I've only recently taken a deeper dive into Beach Boys history and find this a rabbit hole well worth exploring. And jumping back to David's story, it's now the early 1970s when a college-age David Leaf, now a full-bore Brian Wilson Beach Boys and Smile obsessive, moves from New York to Los Angeles with outlandish goals and a knack for being in the right place at the right time. Your journey is so amazing. There's a number of happenstances that contributed and kept you moving along in your way. For example, when you moved to LA at age 19, and within a short period of time moving to LA, you had some momentous encounters. Tell us about those.
It was kind of staggering. I arrived in Los Angeles in the fall of '75 on a Saturday night. I was sleeping on the couch at my ex-girlfriend's apartment where she lived with her parents. And that Monday, I went to the unemployment office to transfer my unemployment claim from New York to California. It's $95 a week, which one could live on at that point in Los Angeles. So Monday morning, she drives me to the unemployment office, which was, in my memory, at the corner of 5th and Broadway. And after I did the paperwork, I walked out of the building and walked north to where she was in a parking lot. And walking towards me is Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. I didn't know the reason he was there. I later found out that the building that I was about to walk past was Brothers Studio. But I was not shy. And I walked up to him and I said, "Hi, Dennis, my name is David Leaf. I just moved to California to write a book about your brother Brian." And I can still hear the echo of his laughter at the absurdity that was going to happen.
Right.
He said, "Good luck." And he walked into the building. And and from the moment I met him outside the studio to the time my first book came out was 3 years. And that seems inconceivable.
Side note here about this era in Beach Boys history. During the 1970s, Brian was famously reclusive, staying in bed for extended periods of time. However, he did contribute to Beach Boys albums along the way, often from a recording studio in his home. Brian's emotional struggles are a big part of his legend and have been documented extensively in various mediums, including the 2014 film Love and Mercy, starring John Cusack and Paul Dano. That film also depicted Brian's eventual involvement with a controversial and controlling psychiatrist. We'll hear a bit about that in a moment, but first, David shares his own path with Brian.
You know, I met him in '76.
Okay.
I met him in the most unlikely place because, remember, his reputation was of somebody who didn't ever get out of bed.
Right. That was the peak of that bedroom era, I think, right?
And a friend of mine from college and I are at the Sawtell YMCA in West Los Angeles, and we're shooting baskets, and two guys walk onto the court and say, "Do you want to play 2-on-2?" One of them was Stan Love, Mike Love's brother, who had just retired from the NBA.
Right.
Towering guy. And the other one was Brian Wilson. And so suddenly I'm playing 2-on-2 basketball with Brian Wilson. And by the way, he played no defense.
Just all shots.
Well, he got the ball, he shot it, and then there was just no D. But the entire time this game went on, I'm thinking to myself, of course, there are no cell phones back then, so I can't take a picture of this. But it's like, are my friends going to believe this? Because it is unbelievable.
Okay, your life seems to be full of those. And I want to get to those in a minute. Some of your origin stories, these encounters. But anyway, let's go on Brian here. So Brian, you met him at the YMCA. Did that develop to become a trusted advisor?
Nothing came of that. At the end of that year, I was invited to the Beach Boys' 15th anniversary party at the Forum after their concert.
Okay.
Because I was starting a fanzine called Pet Sounds. So when we talk about how things happen, if I don't move to California, if I don't start this fanzine, which leads to my first book contract, a lot of it doesn't take place because my story was, I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile.
Of course.
And during the course of writing the book, as I got to know everybody from his life, his mother, the people who were around him during the Smile era, studio musicians, other Beach Boys, the engineers in the studios. As I got to know all of this, I also met a young woman who was one of Brian's guardian angels. She was a girlfriend, but she wasn't a girlfriend in the traditional sense of the word. She was somebody who Brian could go to and know that he wouldn't get yelled at. And her roommate was a massive fan. And they said, David, you're writing this book about Brian. Why don't you come over one night when he's having dinner and just get to know him? Not to do an interview, just hang out with him. So I did. And it was quite a sad night. He was clearly a depressed person. But over the next years and even decades, there were very few people who were looking out for him. And so I remember going with this girlfriend's roommate to Brian's house in the Pacific Palisades because he had just gotten separated and they felt that the sheets and towels he had been given were like threadbare. So we were going to take some really nice sheets and towels to his house. And so you begin to develop a friendship as you're doing things that you're not going to get anything for it. It's just you're doing them out of kindness. I remember going to the hospital. I think it was Christmas 1980, and we brought him. He was hospitalized for some kind of mental difficulties, and we brought him a small artificial Christmas tree for his room.
Oh, that's very sweet.
So and then in the 1980s, he knew that I was somebody who, if he called, I would be there. Not for any creative things, although for decades he tried me to get write lyrics for his songs. But
wow, let's finish that thread. I want to come back to the lyrics.
Anyway, so during the 80s, there was all sorts of stuff going on, including working with the Attorney General to build a case against the psychologist who had taken over his life.
That's another podcast altogether.
Altogether.
Yeah.
And when he was freed from that, during the course of all that is when this woman who I had met because she was roommates with Brian's girlfriend, she and I were married. We became friends, and then she and I lived together, and we got married. And part of the reason for this, we kind of were going to team up to quote unquote save Brian.
Right.
I remember the day specifically because things were not going well. Because what happened was the Attorney General took away that guy's license.
Right.
And so what he did was create a business partnership with Brian. And this was all through the making of Brian's first album. All of this is unfolding. And I was hired by Warner Brothers Records to write the press kit and do an EPK and consult with the president of Warner Brothers Records. So I'm in the middle of all of this. And it was not what one would have wanted for their friend.
Right.
And in early 1989, I remember saying to my wife, I said, how much longer are we going to do this? It was an impossible circumstance.
Right.
And she said, if something doesn't happen by June 1st, and on June 1st, I got a call from a woman named Melinda Ledbetter. And she said, I got your name from Gary Usher. She said, you're somebody who cares about Brian. Gary Usher, will remind our listeners, viewers, wrote In My Room with Brian. So he had known Brian forever. And she came over that night and we talked about the circumstances because she had been dating Brian for a couple of years and then she had gotten cut off. Mm-hmm. So the three of us joined forces in this battle to get rid of Brian's partner.
Right. And so were you like allied with the Beach Boys team at this point, or were you different factions?
It wasn't that we're different factions. I was affiliated with an organization who worked to extricate people who were in a cult, even if it was a cult of just one.
Right.
And so they were our allies. How I met them is a whole other story. That's why I have to keep writing these books, because there's so much to tell. So this was a long, long grind.
Right.
And finally, Brian was, as he describes it, freed from 9 years in prison. And he and Melinda started dating again, and so we became a foursome of, friends going out to dinner.
If you haven't already, please tell a friend about Grind and Flow. And hey, what's the show about, they might rightly ask. Grind and Flow is about the grind, the intention, the hard work, the flow, inspiration, and happenstance. Every episode, 'tis I, Chuck Moore, who presents impactful origin stories and insights into self-care and personal growth. These are relatable stories from notable people across the arts, entertainment, business, and beyond. Grind and Flow, creative minds worth your time. Welcome back to my talk with Brian Wilson biographer David Leaf. We're jumping ahead to the late 1990s. David and Brian have been friends for a while, going to the movies, hanging out during the holidays, etc. And don't think I've forgotten that random thing David just threw out there about Brian asking him to co-write songs. I'm definitely not letting that drop. And on that, you'll hear the wise counsel David received that would impact his decision whether or not to collaborate with one of the leading composers of the rock era. For now, though, we pick back up with David and Brian's story in 1999, as the founding Beach Boy was taking a courageous step, returning to the stage for a solo tour. Brian had developed debilitating stage fright back in the mid-60s and stopped touring altogether. Eventually, he'd tour again with the Beach Boys from time to time, but at the turn of the 21st century, these solo shows were a big deal. By all accounts, Brian was now emotionally healthy and enjoying a career renaissance. Even still, he needed bolstering from a trusted friend.
And then about 2 weeks before the first show, I got a call from Brian saying, I need you and Eva was my wife, to come out here to Chicago where they were rehearsing. I can't do this if I need you here. So he just needed people who loved him unconditionally and could give him kind of a gentle shove towards this. And those first 4 shows were staggeringly surreal in that there he was up on stage taking the plaudits for all this music that, he had not really been recognized for decades, because the Beach Boys were on tour. And he got better and better with each show. So let's do another mini tour of the Northeast, and then another mini tour in Japan. And then he played the Neil and Peggy Young's Bridge School benefit, which was awesome, because he was there with his peers, with Pete Townsend, who got down on his hands and knees, literally down on his knees, and essentially kiss Brian's feet to tell him how much he loved Pet Sounds and how much Brian meant to him. So what was great about the Bridge School benefit and the All-Star tribute that I produced was Brian was with his peers. And so he was getting one-on-one people telling him to his face how much he meant. Because, people can tell you that. They want to kiss up to you. A reporter can say this or that. But when you're sitting on the side of the stage, as he was at Radio City, and Sir George Martin is out there introducing Good Vibrations and talking about Brian and his genius, you can't deny your own eyes. To see Paul Simon and Sir Elton John and David Crosby and Ann and Nancy Wilson from Heart and Jimmy Webb and Vince Gill and all these great artists just talking about your brilliance. All of this fed into his confidence that the time was coming to do what was called Brian Wilson Presents Smile. I mean, at the Radio City show, he performed Heroes and Villains live for the first time in his entire life.
That's exciting.
And it happened almost by accident in a sense, although I've come to believe that none of this was by accident. There seems to have been synchronicity. I had been trying to sell an All-Star tribute for years and years and years, and finally through my dear friend, the late great Chip Racklin, Radio City Entertainment co-financed it with TNT as the broadcast partner. And so this was in March of 2001. In December of the previous year, at a Christmas party at Scott Bennett, one of Brian's band members' house, Brian was sitting on the piano bench with my late wife, and they had their backs to the bench. And Brian had been to our house at Christmas, and he knew how much she loved Christmas. And he said, well, what do you want for Christmas? And she said, for you to play Heroes and Villains. And he said, okay. And he just turned around and started and played it. And
let me jump in. This was a song that had not been performed live by him.
He may have done it in private, but...
Right, wow.
As Darian from his band told me, you couldn't even talk to Brian about Smile and Smile songs right up to that moment. And so they were all, to use the British word, gobsmacked at this moment and thrilled. And when he was finished, I said, Brian, you ought to do that at the tribute. And he said, okay. And when he started it, the New York audience is probably the biggest Brian bass audience in our country, and London being the biggest, outside the U.S. When he started it, the first note, I've been in this town so long in the city, he's singing that in his normal voice, not his falsetto voice.
Okay.
And it sounded like the record.
Wow.
And so people were just, out of their minds excited. It got a big standing ovation at the end. And after that show, which included the Boys Choir of Harlem doing Hour's Prayer, and the trio of Vince Gill, Jimmy Webb, and David Crosby doing Surf's Up, they started adding Smile songs to his touring show. And so that was really a major turning point in this resurrection of not just his career, but of Smile.
That was cool. That was one of the highlights of my life, that song.
That scared the hell out of me. I mean, just in terms of words, as I recall it, we got lucky. We got some wind at our back. We sat there one day, and we knocked it to the ground right away. It just came out.
We nailed it.
From the David Leaf documentary, Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of Smile, that is Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks. Parks is, by the way, perhaps the most colorful figure in the Beach Boys pantheon. And they're talking about the writing of Heroes and Villains, the first song in what would become the Smile Project. So how'd things get sideways? Maybe it was an ambitious yet nebulous creative scope, a pop symphony to God at one point. There was also talk of an overarching narrative about America itself, as seen by a bicycle rider traveling east to west from Plymouth Rock to Diamond Head. And within that shifting framework were Van Dyke Parks' famously or infamously opaque lyrics.
The music hall, a costly bow. The music all is lost for now. To a muted trumpeter swan. Columnated ruins domino.
There was also a fragmented recording process. Heroes and Villains, for example, was recorded in interchangeable segments with numerous iterations. Mind you, this was before the days of digital cut and paste, so arranging required tedious physical cutting pasting of analog tape with a razor blade and glue. But Good Vibrations was created this way. That single was well received and would become one of the Beach Boys' signature hits. But by mid-'67, Brian's internal and external struggles were peaking, even as he and Parks were on a productive roll. Their song fragments were piling up with an unclear notion of a path forward. From accounts in David's book and elsewhere, I get a sense that Smile became an ever-expanding jigsaw puzzle with no box, lid, or even predetermined number of pieces. A puzzle that was put away, but eventually revisited.
And so in 2003, the Royal Festival Hall essentially commissioned Brian to finish some version of Smile, whatever that was going to be, and perform it in 2004. So I went to London with him in 2003 when it was announced, and he was very excited and very happy. And when he came back, it was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? Right. And the reason the documentary Beautiful Dreamer exists is in the summer of 2003, Brian and I were walking back to my apartment from going to the movies, and he said, I can't do this Smile thing unless you're with me every day. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he goes, I need you to be there. Right. Brian talked often about emotional security. So the same way he wanted us with him when he did his first tour in 1999, he wanted me to be there every day as they put, the Smile thing back together, whatever it was going to be. And I said, well, Brian, I've got a company, I've got commitments. I said, the only way I could be there is if I made a documentary. And he said, okay.
Okay. Well, there you go.
And that night he and I and his late wife Melinda talked about it, and she said, well, what will the fans think about this? And I said, honestly, I don't give an F what the fans think about it. Right. I'm trying to reach the 99.9% of the world who have never heard about Smile, who don't know that Brian Wilson was going toe-to-toe with the Beatles in the mid-'60s. Right. And that's our audience. And it was as easy a sale as I ever had. I had a colleague who was a big Smile fan, Richard Walzer, and he got us a meeting at Showtime, and they bought it in the room. And then, our cameras were there while they were rehearsing it. And Darian Sahanaja had worked for months with Brian to figure out, okay, Brian, we're not going to finish the Smile album. We're just going to be performing this music live. How are we going to do it? What's the sequence? What makes sense? And in large part because of the digital universe, Darian loaded all of the pieces that existed into his laptop, and they just played around to find a sequence. Right. And what emerged was this as Brian said, a 3-act rock opera called Brian Wilson Presents Smile. And then the band and had to learn it, which right. and so that's when filming started on the documentary. First, a couple of weeks of vocal rehearsals, and then close to a month of band rehearsals, and then off to London for the world premiere.
It seemed like at times in the rehearsals he was not present, or he was checking out.
Well, it was more than cold feet. Yeah, I would call it abject terror. On the second day of rehearsal, as you see in the documentary, he says, I got to go. Second day of vocal rehearsals. I mean, just the first day he was barely participating. Second day he says, I got to go. And I thought he went to the bathroom. It was like, and then he didn't come back, and the band
Went out
took
for
a break.
cigarettes and didn't come back.
Yeah, and so I went downstairs where Melinda was. I said, "Isn't Brian down here with you?" And she goes, "No, I thought he was up there with you." And she looked out the window and she said, "His car is gone," meaning he was gone.
Right.
And for the next 3+ hours, we did not know where he was. And finally, we got a call from the emergency room at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica.
Oh, dear.
And so that's how afraid of this he was. He was really, really scared of how people would respond to this music. And he overcame those fears. But the last week before the world premiere, he was calling his best friend Danny Hutton every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, just to get reassurance. And Melinda said, "Brian, if you don't want to do this, we'll just call it off." And he says, "No, I have to do it." So you talk about the grind and flow. In '66 there had been this amazing flow of music, and then in late 2003, early 2004, this grind of getting it together and figuring out what it was, and finally getting comfortable to the point where he would come to the rehearsal and he'd say, "Are we gonna do Smile today?" And he'd be happy about it. And then it would go back to the grind of him scared. But once he did it once, his demeanor and life changed forever. In all the years I knew him, he was the happiest in all the years that I knew him. And I met him in 1976, and he passed away in 2025. So we're talking about almost a half a century.
The word that comes up the most often, he's like a shorthand in our current culture for genius, even if you're not a Beach Boys fan. I'm fascinated as a Beatles fan. Why do you think Brian is known as a genius, but Paul McCartney isn't? That there's a case to be made if you look at the quality of their work and the quantity. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Paul, to my estimation, wrote more great songs than anybody in the history of songwriting. Mm-hmm. He was obviously a key Beatle, he and John.
He had a hand in it.
And then he reinvented himself with Wings. And then he went on to have an amazing solo career, touring career. So there are very few people who have accomplished what he did in terms of having second and third acts in their career. I think of Paul Simon, I think of Stevie Wonder as really the only ones. So why people don't call him a genius, maybe it looks like it's too easy for him. It makes no sense why he wouldn't be called a genius. He thinks of himself as a genius. Brian Wilson.
Part of the problem?
Brian Wilson, if you call him a genius, says, "No, I'm ingenious."
Interesting turn of phrase.
The word was put on Brian by Derek Taylor as a publicist. And
also the Beatles publicist for a time, an Apple Records.
He was the Beatles publicist before and after he was the Beach Boys publicist. And it stuck. And then you could put other words on it, like tragic genius.
Right.
So when Smile was shelved, that's who he was. He was this guy who was, in somebody else's words, he was musically trying to touch the sun and got burned and fell to earth, and he's gone. We'll never see that genius again.
Right.
And so that's what the courage of him doing Smile in 2004 was. It was him willing to revisit the best and worst of his times.
Yep. And I also wonder that narrative of the tortured genius, people buy into that easily.
Right.
And also, to your point, McCartney's never left us. He's always present, and almost I wonder if we've taken him for granted.
Well, as a massive Paul fan, he's put out some albums that aren't great. Brian put out so few albums that you couldn't say he's lost it or anything.
Right.
Paul probably, I don't know, 45, 50 solo albums with every imaginable genre, including classical. I mean, he is compositionally a genius. There's no question about it.
Right. Right. And also, I was thinking about like numbers at bat, like Paul's playing baseball, and then Brian's playing golf, where like every swing is counted.
Well, it's you use the word torture genius. That's right, because he knew what he wanted to do. Mm-hmm. He had this flow going in the mid '60s, and that flow was interrupted. Mm-hmm. And even when he wasn't at his peak, like on albums like Wild Honey and Friends and 2020 and Songs for Sunflower and Surf's Up and Holland, you could hear peeking through something that nobody else could do. You listen to a 2-minute song like This Whole World, and it's like, what in the world is that? And so I don't want to say you could understand Beatles records more easily, but they were, they grew quite quickly right in front of our eyes, and we took it for granted almost. They went from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Strawberry Fields Forever in 3 years. I mean, it's astounding.
So hooking on to that notion of creative courage, let's jump back into David's story. As you recall, he relocated to LA in the 1970s. There, he started a Beach Boys fanzine called Pet Sounds, which attracted the attention of Warner Brothers, the band's label at the time. Warner Brothers gave him advanced content for the fanzine, access to fan club mailing lists, and also hired David to write press materials, which granted him more official access to the Beach Boys world. Meanwhile, a small interview with David in the Village Voice led to him getting wind of an unassigned book project well suited for his passion, if not his actual professional experience.
The book was supposed to be what it was like to grow up in Southern California with the Beach Boys as the soundtrack. And I wrote them an impassioned pitch letter saying, why don't we change the focus of the book, not from someone who grew up in California, but from somebody who moved to California because of the Beach Boys music and the California myth. And they said, okay. And before I knew it, I had a book contract. And so it happened very, very quickly.
That's so much about what the show is about, like the grind and that intention, what you set out to do. And then there's the flow, those curveballs that the universe sends you that you can't plan. You still had to put in your hours and to be ready for those opportunities.
Well, I wrote for my high school newspaper, I wrote for my college newspaper, I wrote for the local town newspaper, maybe 250-word articles, maximum 500-word articles. When I was in college, if a course required a long-term paper, I would drop the course. And suddenly I find myself, without hesitation, signing a book contract to deliver 70,000 words. I was so impassioned, if that's a word, about the subject. I was so determined to write this book. And the emotion behind the book was I wanted to grab the world by its collar and shake them and said, do you understand how important this Brian Wilson guy is? Why is he being kind of left in these circumstances that are killing his creativity?
So was there ever a moment you had buyer's remorse that you had to talk yourself through, okay, I've talked my way into this, now how do I get out of it?
No,
you're shaking your head that people can't see that.
Not a moment. Not a moment. I plunged right into it. I scheduled interviews with everybody who I could get to talk with me, several dozen people at least. And then I had to figure out how to write a book, which was, completely beyond any experience I'd ever had.
You talk about courage. There's courage there. Was that innate, or did this project bring it out, or was this something that was already part of your character?
There's a couple of sort of jokes that line. I say, when I was 5 years old, my parents told me I was special, and I believed them.
There you go. Confidence.
But I have overconfidence, which I think is important. I really felt and feel there isn't anything I can't do. And how did I become a filmmaker? I didn't know how to make films, but I didn't hesitate. I really didn't. It was just kind of learning by doing. And it was always, if I were the audience for this, what would I want to see? What would I want to read? So I was creating essentially for myself, and hoping and believing there would be enough people who would like what I did, that I could do the next thing.
So are you able to bottle this up and push it to your students to encourage them?
I do it every single year. I talk to them. The analogy I use is, look, you guys got into UCLA. You're brilliant. You're now upper division students. You're taking my courses. So you've succeeded at UCLA. So think of yourself, you're on the good ship UCLA, you're sailing along, and here's graduation. My job is to help steer you out into the post-graduation waters, because otherwise, when you hit graduation, you will have been on the Titanic, and graduation is the iceberg.
Right.
So I'm really, in all of my classes, whatever the subject is, it's about giving them a sense of how the real world works and how to be successful and what it takes. Almost none of my students in my songwriting class are going to become songwriters or documentary makers. Certainly in my Beatles class, none of them are going to become Beatles. But what did it take for these people? I really am I was so into origin stories in all of my classes. And I would do my classes like inside the actor's studio or between two ferns, depending upon what generation you're coming from.
Right.
Where I would bring out guests and I would take them through their life. Now, if they're a documentary maker, it's like, okay, how did you become a documentary maker? How did you become Morgan Neville or R.J. Cutler or whoever it might be? In my Beatles class, I interviewed Michael Lindsay Hogg talking about Let It Be, but how did you get to be the person who's making Let It Be? Right. In my songwriting class, where I had staggeringly great guests, Jimmy Webb, Man and Wild, Mike Stoller, Lamont Dozier, Mac Davis, on and on and on, Randy Newman, Burt Bacharach. I take them back to, where did music come into your life? How did it come into your life? When did you know that music was your life? And I always talked about these 4 Ds. I created this, simple construct: devotion, dedication, discipline, and determination as how you succeed in whatever you do. And when I said it in front of Randy Newman, he said, "Oh, you forgot the 5th D." I said, "What's that?" He goes, "Depression."
So if you had to deal with that, how do you push through that? It sounds like you got this overconfident, but you're human, and at some points when you're at low points, how do you push through that?
Well, my students will ask me, they'll look at my web page or they'll look at my IMDb page, and they'll say, "Professor, how did you do all of those things?" And my answer is, by being willing to take no 99% of the time. By learning that no just means not now. That the marketplace doesn't want this today, but it might want it in 6 months or a year or 5 years. And I just, as I said, the confidence I had that my ideas were great and that they would find a home. Sometimes it was true, and sometimes it never happened. I've got stacks and stacks of pitches and treatments and scripts that never got made. But I was a sitcom writer for two years on the new Leave It to Beaver. And I love sitcom.
I'm sorry, that's another podcast. I'm a Leave It to Beaver fan. Wow, we need to pick up that conversation. Before we wrap with David Leaf, I do want to get to him turning down Brian's offer to write songs together. And also a few parting words about Smile, which was released to great acclaim in 2004. For the nuts and bolts particulars of this dramatic completion and eagerly anticipated premiere, I direct you, of course, to David's book, Smile, The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson. Spoiler alert, it's a happy ending. Here's David. So with all that confidence, in spite of all that confidence, you declined to write lyrics with Brian. Tell me about that.
Well, Brian, when he had a song, when he was composing a melody, he wanted to get a lyric right away. Sometimes he would have one himself, but other times he had an idea for what the song might be about, but he knew that I could write. In fact, one of my favorite moments in life is on Hollywood Boulevard. They have these souvenir shops where you can buy fake Oscars, like that World's Greatest Mom, the World's Greatest Dad. And one day he came over. He had been there, and he gave me 2 trophies, like World's Greatest Comic and World's Greatest Writer. I was saying, just as sweet as could be. Right. So he knew I had an ability to put word to paper. But my late wife was extremely smart. I like to say she was playing three-dimensional chess while the rest of us were playing checkers. She said, if you're Brian's friend, you're Brian's friend. And look at all of Brian's friends who became lyricists and where they are now in his life. And none of them are in his life now. So if you write lyrics for Brian, great. But there will become a time where you will no longer be his friend first. You'll be that guy who I don't want to see because I'm not writing with you anymore. And there was one time where I didn't say no. When he was working on That Lucky Old Son, he called me and he said he needed some narration between the sections. So this wasn't lyrics. This was narration to go between the sections. Well, I've written voiceover. I could do that. And so I got something over to him really quickly. And then about a week or 2 later, he called me, and I knew right away something was wrong. It was like, David, Van Dyke's going to write the narration pieces. And I was like, that's great. And he was so relieved that my feelings weren't hurt, that he wasn't using that narration.
Well, if you're going to get pushed out, why not? How can you argue with that?
You couldn't argue with it, but I think what I wrote was better. Those of us who were mourning the loss of Smile for decades, we believed that if Brian ever could somehow finish it, whatever that meant, as he did in 2004, it would lift this enormous weight from him, and he would then again create more great music. And that was true. He wrote That Lucky Old Son. He did his Gershwin album, in which the Gershwin estate gave him songs that he could finish of Gershwin's. He wrote some great stuff for the Beach Boys reunion album. He wrote some great stuff for his last solo work. And if you look at the outpouring of love for him after his passing from the musical world, those who said things, Elton John, Sir Elton John, Sir Paul McCartney, and on and on. Yes. Everybody who you care about, who to me matters, and plenty of people who I don't even know who they are necessarily, had something to say about how great Brian Wilson is. So, what can you say? The guy gave us so much. Right. And so when people are mourning, we're just mourning the loss of his physical presence, which he had been in declining health, both physically and mentally, for a number of years. So the music is all there. So as long as there's electricity, Brian Wilson is with us.
Right. And it's only a year out. I'm so sorry for your loss, for obviously your friend and someone whose work and life meant a lot to you. So thank you for sharing these wonderful stories, a unique perspective on music that's so universal.
Thank you for having me, Chuck.